Lovely. So welcome to the webinar with Helen Myers, getting to grips with the new GCSE. So as I said, I'm David Blow. We've got members of the AWL London Committee doing the moderating. Welcome to them. And Helen Myers will be doing the main part of the presentation. But I'm just going to give some of the initial context. But before I do that, just a reminder, do join AWL Languages. There's a link there. All of the things that we're doing are enabled by and supported by the Association for Language Learning.
And please tell us in the chat if you are a member.
And a couple of events to flag to you, in particular the language show, and which runs from the 10th to the 12th of November, but a couple of times on Saturday the 11th of November, 3 o'clock, Helen's giving a further update, and then the ever popular 5 o'clock teachers show and tell. Helen and Joe Day will be doing that. And the other event to draw your attention to is the annual AWL London January event held as usual at the BFI. We're very grateful to them for their continued hospitality. That's the programme. Key feature will be more on getting ready for the new GCSE, and we're delighted that we'll be having Adam Lamb joining us and representatives from the awarding organisations. There'll be exam board stands, advice, and then the other main feature. You know, with pandemic, we lost so much in terms of the residential exchanges, day trip experiences. So as people are emerging from the pandemic, people are saying, oh, how do you do a residential? How do you do an exchange? And so we're delighted. We've got a number of colleagues who'll be running a couple of sessions on the practicalities, or all about the extracurricular activities, whether it's at school or abroad or within the UK. And then we're also pleased that we'll be getting some feedback on the current GCSE, and Nick Mayer doing his usual job application clinic, and then the AGM. So do book for that. And then final date, looking ahead, 8th and 9th of March is the AWL Language World Conference, a great place to meet up with people and, as I say, replenish your enthusiasm. This gives you links to where you can look not only for this webinar, but I think Helen's done well over 100 webinars. That's a link to go to, and they're all there for you to have a look through. So getting to grips with the new GCSE. This webinar, we're really focusing on the exam papers. So using the sample assessment materials, SAMs, and the mark schemes. 3 questions we'll be looking at. How similar or different are they compared with current exams? To what extent the exam boards have a common or different approach? And above all, what implications are there for your scheme of work? How much do you need to change? How much may you choose to change? And it's divided into those 4 sections. So firstly, the overall introduction. Who is Helen? Loads of links there. I don't think many of you need much to do that. But what Helen has done is loads and loads of analysis. Links are done through her blog post, and she's also done 14 detailed videos on YouTube. So all of those are there. You can see on the right hand side some of those videos all on Helen's YouTube channel, the playlist. You've got the tiny URLs there for that. The context in which we're operating, well, just a reminder about the timeline. It's DFE and Ofqual who specified what content must be tested and how, and we're looking at French, German and Spanish, not other languages. First teaching September 24, first testing in June 26. The exam boards then responded. They've produced draft specifications and sample assessment materials, and at this moment in time, AQA and Edexcel in French have had theirs approved by Ofqual, and we saw today that a second EduCast draft in French has been published, and Helen will do some more work updating that over half term. And that's why the examples in this talk are in French. On the basis of that approval by Ofqual, AQA and Edexcel then published draft German and Spanish specifications, which very much are along the same lines as the French, but those are still awaiting formal approval. So we're assuming that autumn 23, you either have or you're well into the process of selecting the exam board, ready for options evenings in the spring, but you're also starting to think about changes that you need to make to your schemes of work. And then autumn 24 will be the first year 10 cohort starting the new GCSE right through to summer 26, which will be the first assessment of the new ones. 4 key messages that please do bear in mind. There are changes in the formal requirements in the subject content, particularly that published by DFE and Ofqual, but as we'll see, there's less change in the actual exam experience, and that's why we're focusing on the SAMs, the sample assessment materials that have been approved by Ofqual, to see actually in practice what does it really look like. 2 other perhaps like more subtle points. Often when you're looking at exam papers, you're thinking, oh, that makes that easier, my kids can get hold of it. But there are 2 problems with that. Firstly, a very easy exam doesn't mean fairer grades. If you get bunch marks, it can be much more random and much less effective discrimination between candidates. And also, it does not mean higher grades. Comparable outcomes, which is set by Ofqual, not the exam board, means that essentially the percentages getting each grade stay the same from one year to the next, irrespective of how easy or difficult the actual exam is. And then finally, it's almost a plea, a passionate plea that teaching and learning should surely be broader and richer than the actual exam. Look at the national curriculum and please think about the teaching and learning. Obviously, we need to be guided by the final assessment, but do please hang on to all the broad and rich things that are already being done so brilliantly by teachers. One quick mention about severe grading, particularly as today's the day that the DFE have published their performance tables for June 24. There is still a major issue in the 23, sorry, the severe grading that takes place in French, German and Spanish relative to other EBAC subjects, English, math, science, history, geography. FFT kindly did a revisiting the subject, and you can see from the graph starkly German and French are the most severely graded. Computer science, there's an issue with that as well, but it's the modern languages that are at least half a grade more severely graded than all the other EBAC subjects. And it's just so unfair for teachers, because pupils will think that they're not doing as well in languages, whereas actually it's just a grading issue. And senior teams also may not realise that. So please keep pushing back. I say particularly today, the day that performance tables are being published. And I've written an article published in Language Today, but a downloadable version is available. The link is given there. It's on the ALL London website. Please use it. Please give it to your senior team or anybody else who doesn't realise the unfair, unlevel playing field that language teachers are having to face, and the perception issues it produces in pupils because of the reality of the severe grading. And now I'd like to pass over to Helen to look in more detail at the subject content and the sample assessment materials.
So, yes, before we look at the exam papers in one by one, this is a background to what is being tested as laid down by the Department for Education in its subject content. So first of all, what about vocabulary? There's a common approach to the selection of vocabulary. Just one source matched the DFE requirements, a frequency dictionary, and that's based largely on official language captured in parliamentary debates. And 85% of the words selected by the boards have to be from the top 2,000 words in this dictionary. So there's actually quite a lot of overlap between the boards. Some extras are allowed and they're quite limited, but do make sure that you include those in your teaching. I've listed those there. The DFE final version allowed themes, and although titles differ, my observation is that the content is very similar and familiar. So for example, talking about people, lifestyle, media, education, work, environment, travel, and throughout both boards ensure inclusive language, images and tasks. Now, I've highlighted the two key differences here, but in fact, when you look at the exam papers, the AQA does reference shopping, and Edexcel does refer to famous people. Both exam boards offer these really useful interactive vocabulary spreadsheets so that you can get an idea as to what texts and transcripts may combine. So there you've got for the AQA, and there it is for the Edexcel. And David has put together a spreadsheet which brings them together. It may not be totally accurate. It takes quite a long time to do, but I am going to be uploading that to my blog next week so that if you want to, you can use that. The culture words which they've selected differ, but exam boards can gloss proper names which were not on their defined list. Now, this slide really demonstrates just how hard the job was for the exam boards in selecting that precious 15% beyond the 2000 list. For example, if you look for animals in that top 2000, only 2 types of animal appear in the top 2000. But we know it's a topic that children really like to talk about. It's an area which is usually pretty inclusive. And of course, we're not going to drop this topic just because only a few animals are mentioned as high frequency. And indeed, the boards themselves may have added some more, but we're going to be teaching them anyway, aren't we? After each section, I'm going to include my own personal recommendations. And here for vocabulary, this is what I suggest. Retain vocabulary which pupils may need for speaking and writing about their own contexts, but signpost it perhaps as on a need to know basis. And then obviously add words where necessary, like for example, those cultural words. On to grammar and phonics. The DFE specifies these, so they're the same whichever board you choose. And I've made a spreadsheet which itemizes the grammar and could be useful if you're doing an audit of your current materials. Overall, the range of grammar is reduced. So, for example, in French, no pluperfect or subjunctive for the higher tier, no juxtaposed pronouns, and the irregular verbs are quantified, which actually I think is quite helpful. But all the elements must be known for production. There's no such thing as receptive only. And there are some additions to the foundation tier. So, for example, you do have in French regular ER verbs in the imperfect tense. There's a defined list of strategies for working out the meanings of words derived from those in the vocabulary list called derivational morphology. And these derived words will only appear in the reading exam. Now, in my document, I've summarized the verbs needed. So in particular, notice that in the requirement, you have here regular non-ER verbs, but also regular high frequency patterns, which are in 7 clusters of IR and RE verbs. So these are the ones that they have to include. And I've gone through the verbs which each board has chosen to demonstrate those patterns for each spec. So here are the first 3 here. So the ones which go like choisir are written there. As it happens, AQA and Excel have chosen to include choisir, but then there may be some which one board chooses and others don't as you go through. So there they are for the first 3. And there they are for the others. So hopefully that might be useful for you, particularly if even in Key Stage 3, you might be introducing the idea of different conjugations. Look at the verbs that are going to come up in the GCSE and perhaps deliberately use those as your examples. The phonics are defined in the subject content, so they're identical for each board. And you can see the way that in each specification, they write them and give you examples of them. 2 examples in the AQA and 1 in the Excel. And then implications, obviously audit your existing work and add anything that's missing. By the way, sorry, I think I've just missed a page there. Sorry. You know what? Sorry about this. Audit your existing work, add anything that's missing. Especially checking that those prefixes and suffixes can change a word, then subtract anything that's not needed for the GCSE, which your students have found perhaps off-putting, although, retain it if they are coping, if they're enjoying, or if they're actually asking for those items, and particularly if you've got some potential A-level students. And there's been so much about pronunciation for primary and Key Stage 3, so I'm pretty sure that this will have been covered in Key Stage 3, but obviously continue to reinforce that value of pronunciation, which is pretty obvious, to be honest. So now on to the tasks. There are 14 tasks, 14 slides that I'm going to be going through. First of all, the reading. And what I'm doing is comparing the first question of each board. So here's question 1 of the AQA, 3 separate sentences, and the candidate has to select from a multi-choice grid resulting in 3 marks. There's a deliberate reference to this being from an authentic context in the target country. Edexcel has got 3 separate groups of 2 sentences, and then 6 multi-choice questions resulting in 6 marks. So taking the papers as a whole, all questions are in English. That's required by the subject content, which I think is a good thing. Both boards have more multi-choice than open-ended English questions. Edexcel has slightly more open-ended than AQA does. And for listening and reading, Edexcel has a steady incline of difficulty throughout the paper, whereas AQA has peaks and troughs within a steady incline of difficulty. And AQA has the principle of making the context based in the target country. Now, this requirement for inference is limited to working out the meaning of single words from a context in reading only. And both boards test it through setting 2 multi-choice questions where candidates select the correct translation or the correct category of a word. To be honest, I think the papers don't really look that different from now, but especially as they near the exam, you'll want to give pupils experience of being tested in English on the specific words in the specification, including those cultural words, and being familiar with the test types, including that multi-choice inference. And you can also deliberately include words with prefixes and suffixes which change the meanings of the words on the defined list. And remember, that's only needed for the reading. Onto the translation into French. You can see that the task is the same as the current specification, but as required by the subject content, the mark schemes are less stringent, rewarding appropriate rendering of the meaning rather than totally accurate translation. And it is possible to get full marks even with errors. So here's the AQA higher one, and that's presented in the form of separate sentences with chunked mark schemes. And it is less stringent. So for example, je vais étudier does actually allow for, yeah, I'm going to study, but also I'm studying. It is permitted as well. Edexcel also has separate sentences for the foundation, but in higher, as you see here, they're presented as a paragraph. And the mark scheme here is holistic rather than chunked, but it also is less stringent. You can get full marks even if there are errors, as long as they don't detract from the clarity of the message. So for example, the model answer given doesn't translate that word donc, meaning so you can still get full marks even if every single word isn't translated. Implications, well, I think they're nice positive changes to be made there. Focus on appropriate rather than exact translations, and only use words from the defined content when you come to prepare them for the test, for the assessment. I'd note that the passages in the SAMs are pretty familiar in terms of vocabulary, and that has been approved by Ofqual. So on to the listening. As now, AQA allows 2 hearings for each question, and it has short chunks followed by 1 or 2 questions. So for example, at foundation, there are 12 recordings followed by 1 question, 8 recordings by 2, and 1 recording by 4 questions. So here are questions 1 to 4 on the foundation listening. Candidates hear a short statement of about 10 to 11 words, spoken by 1 person, so no need for a name. That's heard twice, and then they answer 1 question. And then it's the same for 3 more questions. As far as the whole paper is concerned, it lasts 35 minutes. It includes 5 minutes reading and 2 minutes checking time. New for Edexcel is that the student can hear each passage 3 times. In questions 1 to 3 of Edexcel, candidates hear 3 people. They're each introduced by their name, and they're saying a very short sentence each. So you hear that 3 times, and then you answer 3 questions. The audio chunks over the paper do tend to be longer than AQA, and there are more questions per chunk, but they are heard 3 times. The whole paper lasts 45 minutes, and that includes 5 minutes checking time. Implications are similar to the reading, really, but in particular, I'd recommend simplifying the demands of listening assessment wherever possible, including having it just at a moderate pace. And of course, this doesn't mean that you have to avoid exposing students to lovely, authentic listening for the purposes of teaching and learning and appreciating culture. Please never stop doing that. Never stop playing music in your classes. As David said earlier on, you do have to keep the teaching and learning separate from the assessment. On to dictation, and this is one people have been very concerned about, especially with its potential for penalising those with dyslexia. But when you look at how the exam boards have interpreted the requirements, I think it is reassuring. Here's the AQA foundation. The continuous sentences all have very familiar words in them, don't they? And then the unknown words, poulet, chicken, chemise, shirt, they're not really that unusual, are they? The passage is heard 3 times, and for the second hearing, it's chunked following those forward arrows, forward slashes. Edexcel has a mixture of gap fill and continuous sentences, and it also has very familiar words, I would say. And the words which are the unknown words would be violin, violon, and radio. And that passage also is heard 3 times. AQA has 2 holistic mark grids, and it rewards communication and grammatical accuracy separately. So, for example, il faut dire, if you'd spelt F-A-U-X for F instead of F-A-U-T, that would be awarded for communication, but not for grammar. Edexcel has a mark scheme which is targeted per word, and every 2 words gets a mark. The criteria is purely on accurate transcription of sounds to the symbol. So it would accept il faut manger, where F-A-U-X, where it's spelled F-A-U-X instead of F-A-U-T, and manger if it's spelled with E-Z instead of E-R. But it would, on the other hand, it would reject, for example, meilleur, if there was perhaps an extra I before the EUR, that would not be credited. Implications, well, obviously, I would say expose students to listen and follow written transcripts as much as possible. I think familiarity with the way spelling matches sound is best done by loads of experience in following transcripts while hearing it, and just getting to know the words which will come up. You can't be knowing the words. And note that there are only ever going to be 2 words which are not on the defined list. I do worry about the potential demotivating effect that an obsession with spelling could have on dyslexic students who, frankly, can be very successful in our subject, where writing is not the be-all and end-all, as it might be in other subjects. So although they obviously need to have that experience of the test type at some time before the exam, it doesn't have to be in Key Stage 3, and it definitely shouldn't be used as a discriminator for setting. Now on to speaking. The role play is the first task for AQA and the second task for Edexcel. AQA has informal social contexts, which are the same as for the photo card and the read aloud conversations, and candidates need to make 4 statements and 1 question for both foundation and higher. For Edexcel, the contexts are formal and defined. The foundation requires 4 statements and a question, and the higher requires 3 statements and 2 questions. For both, the criteria is on communication, not accuracy, as you can see here for the Edexcel and here for the AQA. Read aloud is new. All words are on the defined list, and the SAMS examples have very familiar vocabulary. And I noticed that the final versions of the SAMS were simpler than the original ones which were in the draft. So I'm guessing that this was a particular requirement from Ofqual, which I think is good news. So there's the AQA and there's the Edexcel. The criteria for AQA is for pronunciation, and note that the specification explicitly allows students to self-correct their pronunciation, and it's the final attempt which is marked. The criteria for Edexcel makes reference to sound symbol correspondences with the emphasis on symbol, not spelling. The Edexcel conditions for preparation explicitly allows 1 minute to practice aloud before the test starts. The follow-up questions to the read aloud don't test comprehension of the text, which had been the original intention. AQA has got 4 unseen open-ended questions about the candidate's own experience, and Edexcel has 2 unseen questions about the candidate's own experience. And this is where obviously you'd be doing your students a disservice if you didn't stray beyond the defined list and allow them to learn the words for their own favourite subjects or birthday activities, for example. The criteria is solely for communication for those in both exam boards. As now, there's a photo description followed by questions relating to the photo. AQA doesn't define what needs to be included in the description of the photo, the question 1, while Edexcel defines 3 areas. So the people, where they are, and what they're doing, an activity. With AQA, the teacher has free choice of questions within the theme for the follow-up questions, conversation, and students don't know which of the 3 themes will be covered beforehand. While Edexcel has 2 compulsory unseen questions and 1 guided, and then the rest are free choice within the thematic context. And I presume that's to check any temptation to rote learn all questions and answers, because Edexcel does allow students to choose 1 of 2 thematic contexts generated just for each individual pupil 2 weeks in advance of the test. So 6 thematic contexts, 2 weeks before the test, the pupil will have a choice between 2 of those. As you see, the photos are in colour for Edexcel and black and white for AQA. The AQA criteria, though, do not penalise for imagining the colour of anything. Overall, then, I'd recommend broadly retaining whatever existing practice and resources you have for preparing students to have a conversation after the read aloud and the picture card tasks. They're all open-ended and allow students to talk about their own experience. Use English for role play instructions and include transactional. And I would say do that whichever board you're selecting, that's going to be useful. As with the dictation, I'd play down the read aloud as a tested assessment until you really have to. But of course, we all have them reading things aloud anyway, don't we? That's part of our teaching. It's another layer for remembering language. The criteria for speaking and writing are really clear and well explained and exemplified. So you can reflect this in your own internal criteria and explicitly talk through the criteria with your students. Let's go on to writing, where there are the fewest changes of all to the current requirements with AQA and Edexcel. I have noted in the draft of EduCast that that's where there is a different one. They have a task which responds to a stimulus, which will be different, but that's something I'll look at when it's been approved. So the first task for both is to write single sentences. AQA requires 5 sentences, Edexcel requires 4, and both mark on communication. So yes, communication is still a thing. Although the word is deliberately omitted in subject content document, which of course is wedded to the primacy of knowledge, thank you to the exam boards for bringing in this word communication, which we know is important. AQA requires, the second task for both is writing sentences in response to bullet points. So AQA requires 5 sentences. They're all in the present tense. Edexcel gives a choice of 2. Each has 3 bullet points, where 2 are in the present and 1 in the future. And both reward communication and accuracy separately, you can see there. AQA, in addition, has a multi-choice grammar question, which is just for foundation, and here it is. As now, there's an overlap question, a choice of 2 at AQA, 3 bullet points and 3 timeframes. There's no required opinion as now. It's no longer defined in the subject content that you have to include that, but I'm absolutely sure that we will train our students to add an opinion anyway, because it's part of our DNA, I think. Edexcel, also a choice of 2. It has 4 bullet points and 3 timeframes, and it does require an opinion. The higher only, as for the current specification, but the instructions are in English. So here we are for AQA, which has 2 bullet points and it requires 2 tenses. Excuse me. This is to keep me to time that I'm reading it. And Edexcel has 4 bullet points and 3 tenses, with the spec saying it will always be a formal context. But I do notice that when you looked at the SAMs, that is also a formal context. So frankly, I'd say that there doesn't need to be much change at all for Edexcel and AQA approved specifications. Just check that the themes are covered, that they have an experience of multi-choice grammar. I'm sure you do that sort of thing already. And get them into the good practice of get into the good practice of giving them options as well, so that they're used to having to make a decision, and guide them as to how they're going to make that decision when they've got options, because that's not always a helpful thing. And consciously bear in mind inclusivity. As for the speaking, make sure that also that you're using transparent criteria and that you have exemplifications. The last task to look at is the translation. AQA has got 5 sentences to translate at foundation, and it's the same for Edexcel. Now, as for the translation into English, AQA criteria rewards chunks for rendering meaning, and you can get top marks even if there are some errors. And then you have a separate grid for accuracy. Whereas Edexcel gives a holistic mark for transferring meaning, but again, perfection is not required for that top mark. And there's a separate grid out of 4 for accuracy. The obvious implication is to devise assessments which test the defined vocabulary and grammar, and to create mark schemes which are less stringent. So as promised at the beginning, here are the main messages, and I hope that this speedy run through has reassured people who might have been concerned that the exams were going to be massively different and that they might have to throw out all the fantastic work they've done for the current specifications. I think it's been really heartening that the exam boards have been very complimentary in their reports about how we as teachers have been preparing our students for the current specification. So it's good to see that we can go on using those useful strategies. There are features which I think will make the exam less daunting and seem easier. Those questions in English, defined vocabulary, a reduced grammatical content, but still look for an exam where you feel your students will be appropriately ranked, because that is what this exam is about, whether we like it or not. And then I am sorry to bring a dampener to anyone who's excited about the prospect of higher grades because of this exam. Even if the pedagogy and the new exams result in some big upsurge in attainment, with the current system of comparable outcomes, the overall outcomes cannot change, as David said earlier, unless Ofqual decides to make changes to those expected outcomes. The presentation has focused purely on exams, but I hope I've convinced you that you will not be wasting your or your students' time if you include rich cultural experiences in your teaching, allowing pupils to have the satisfaction of recognizing words in authentic contexts, whether encountered in the classroom or in contact with real native speakers. I think we owe it to our students to prepare them as best as we can for exams, but also we owe it to them to prepare them for real life experiences using language. And I'm sure that as enthusiasts, which I'm sure those of you here at this time in the night when you've got school tomorrow, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted on that. So thank you so much for listening. Please do keep in touch, keep sharing, support any publishers. I know that we've got people from the exam boards here. They can make our lives easier. And can I say that this is going to be available to you? And also I asked the exam boards to give me a couple of slides so that at the end of this presentation, which you'll have a copy of, you'll have links to all of the training that they're giving. I've been reading really good things on the social media about how helpful it has been to go along to those training sessions. So if exam boards are here and they want to give links, that's fine, but I will be including those slides in the follow-up.
And can I finish by thanking Helen, and also to say that if you are an ALL member, or if your school is an ALL member, then Helen is prepared to come and help you with training or preparation for free as part of the whole ALL family. So many thanks to Helen for that.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for that, David. And thank you, David, for all you do for us.
Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, on that, just to say, for example, I know that there's one school who they've asked me to go and be involved in an after school, a twilight session where they're getting together to talk about GCSE, and there's another school that's asked me to go up to Cambridgeshire to go and speak to them. So I'm very happy to do that. If anybody from AWL wants to do it, that's fine. Okay.
Do we stop recording then?
And then we do stop recording.
Open
Yes.
video and chat for anyone who wants to.
Yes. So stop recording.